Hi, my name is Martin Molina, and this is the podcast Conversaciones de Mentes, and I'm its host. If you only speak English, you can skip ahead 30 seconds. I'm going to give a brief announcement to my Spanish-speaking audience that don't speak in English. Bueno, bienvenidos a Conversaciones de Mentes. Yo sé que hay varios de ustedes que no hablan en inglés y este episodio es en inglés y no lo van a poder entender, pero esto es solamente por esta excepción, entonces espero que sigan escuchando y se conecten la próxima semana, que otra vez voy a empezar a publicar en español. Okay, welcome back, English speakers and listeners. If you like this podcast and if you like this episode specifically, you can share it on social media so more people get to listen to it. I'd be really grateful for that. And I hope you enjoy Jay's ideas and my ideas about spirituality, consciousness, and about Black Lives Matter. And yeah, without further ado, here's my conversation with Jaya Jagganath. Jay, welcome. This podcast name is in Spanish, so I'm going to avoid it for all our English listeners. And for all my usual Spanish listeners, this is not going to be the new language for the podcast, but I think Jay is a really cool guy. I really like his ideas, although we have pretty different worldviews, and I think voices like his should be amplified in whatever way possible. So this is my attempt to do that to my Colombian audience. And for starters, why don't you let people know, those who don't know you here, who you are, what you've done, like a short account of your life. I know that's hard, but you can give it a try.
Once we start talking about ourselves, we can't stop.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me, Martin. I never heard someone say it like that voices like mine should be amplified. And it's not because I'm Black, but because I have something to say that you appreciate. So I appreciate that appreciation. Thank you for having me on here. My background, I was training as a classical ballet dancer from about the ages of 9 to 18. And at the age of 18, I joined a monastery. And I lived in the monastery for the next 13 years of my life. The reason for joining the monastery is like the reason anyone does anything dramatically different from what they were doing before. There were some questions, usually existential questions, that needed to be answered. And I was looking in a direction, as many do, towards spirituality. And having discovered a spirituality that was capable of answering the many questions that I had and some, I decided to commit to that spirituality completely and kind of undergo the experience of ego death and letting go of the world that I had known up until that point, and fully embrace a new identity in a world that I didn't really know that much about, but was wanting to discover. And so I ended up in a monastery for 13 years of my life, from the ages of 18 to about 31, 32. Then I came out of the ashram, the monastery, and eventually I ended up in New York, where I was, you can say in a sense, employed at a place called the Bhakti Center, which was like a cultural center dedicated to spreading the message of Krishna Bhakti. Krishna Bhakti Monastery was the type of monastery that I joined. And then I was working at this organization that was dedicated to spreading the message of Krishna Bhakti. And I was doing that from 2016 to the present. It's still happening, but we're on quarantine. So I'm kind of still working there, but, it's in a little bit of a different capacity because of the quarantine situation. So yeah, that's my story in a nutshell. Not wanting to go on and on and on. I mostly spend time traveling a lot, teaching Bhagavad Gita, teaching Yoga Sutras, teaching, sort of the metaphysics of the Eastern tradition, particularly the tradition known as Vedanta from India. I'm kind of known for that. I write, I joke around, I do videos. People find me a little bit funny and quirky and charismatic. And I try to use that to spread the message of devotion and love. I guess that's my summary.
Yeah. Uh, One of the things I most appreciate from meeting you, and I know we've talked really little. We maybe talked a couple of days, but I don't know if this is right. I've kept a tab. I'm going to I'm going to make like a small announcement. My English might be a little bit rusty because although I read and I listen to a ton of podcasts in English, it's really different speaking it, and I haven't been doing so lately. So
Well, your
I
English
might.
is better than my Spanish.
That's why we're doing it in English. Okay. Um. So, no, what I wanted to say is that I feel, and one of the reasons that I follow you and that I wanted to have you on here is that I feel that you have a unique voice. I think you have a unique perspective on let's say scripture and life in general. And I really I'm like a seeker of people like you in my life, and I feel in a way I feel really lucky talking to you right now, because I feel that folks like you are far. I can't remember what this saying is, but few and far between.
Yeah.
And I don't want to I don't want to shower you more with compliments. I really want to get into the stuff, but I want my listeners to get a grasp of why you're here and why, although my podcast is in Spanish and the purpose of the podcast is having these types of conversations in Spanish, that I feel they are few and far between as well.
Mm.
But I made the exception in this case because I really wanted to have this conversation.
Well, again, very flattered. I don't think I will be able to live up completely to Martin's glorification, but I am appreciating it, and it does give me something to work on.
Okay, cool. So as I let you know before we started talking, I have a ton of subjects I want to talk about. So I'm thinking of starting um, from the narrowest one and more current topic, and then moving towards broader and more universal and maybe even eternal questions as we talk on.
Okay.
So in that sense, I wanted to start talking about um, like the situation right now in the U.S. that I feel is slowly, no, even like rapidly compounding,
Yeah.
and there's a lot of information out there. I've seen a ton of people that live in Latin America comment on it from very shallow points of view, because although um, they are not experiencing life in the US, they are also not investigating thoroughly enough, in my opinion, what different opinions are around the subject. So, and I heard you speaking in a short video you made on Instagram regarding the death of 10 African American men in Chicago during
Yeah.
Memorial Day weekend.
Yes.
And it was something that I heard right after it happened, because I follow Kamele, that's this guy on Twitter,
Okay.
and he mentioned it, and he even like sort of in a premonition, he said, this happens and no one talks about it, but keep your eye out, because something else is going to happen, and then the media is going to explode, and this will be forgotten and it will never be mentioned. So maybe you can tell people what happened and what was your take on it.
About this Darnell Fisher case, and the one that I did my Instagram video on.
Yes.
Yeah, well, just to not to spend too much time on context, but basically, the Black Lives Matter movement in the States, the claim is that they care about the lives of Black people, Black lives and Black experiences. And so if that is true, when you look at the demographic, the Black demographic in the States, one might wonder, what are the biggest problems facing that demographic? Now, obviously, you have to do research in order to know that. It's not very difficult research necessarily, but you have to spend some time online and doing some work to find out what are the biggest problems that face the Black demographic in the United States of America. With a little bit of research done, one will discover that Black on Black crime is by far the biggest problem facing the Black demographic. And why that's such a big problem may be rooted to other problems that is largely found in that demographic as well. Not just Black demographic, but a huge percentage found in this demographic of things such as fatherless homes, which connects to things like an influx of gang participation because of lack of guidance in the home, and the need for ritual, and the need for rite, and the need of belonging. So lack of fathers in the home, leading to people joining gangs, and so this becomes a huge problem in the demographic itself. This is if one does just a little bit of research. This is a very big problem in that demographic. When you look at police brutality, it is definitely a problem, but it's not a problem that disproportionately affects the Black demographic. Well, at least apparently, according to certain statistics, the biggest, let's say, victims of police brutality, at least according to the stats that I've seen, is the white demographic in the United States of America. So when you take all these factors together, if you believe them, and I think this is the way I would really like to navigate this subject matter. If you take all these facts together and take them to be true, then how is it that a problem that is largely minor in the demographic is getting all the energy, and a problem that is the biggest problem in the demographic gets hardly any energy at all? And in my Instagram video, what I was talking about is that over the Memorial Day weekend, about 49 people were shot and injured and 10 people killed, all Black on Black crime, happening in the south side of Chicago, which is a part of, I'm from Chicago, by the way, and I have family. I didn't really grow up in the south side of Chicago, but I had family that I would spend my summers with on the south and west side of Chicago, both places notorious for Black on Black crime. And so here's a problem that comes up in that demographic, and it never gets talked about. So in the south side of Chicago, 10 people were killed in just 2 days, and 50 people shot in just 2 days. And it hardly gets any attention. So if Black Lives Matter, as the narrative goes, cares about the lives of Black people and Black experiences, how come this issue, which is a huge issue for the demographic, never gets brought up in a discussion whenever Black Lives Matter are doing their thing? And in fact, at least in my experience talking to people about it, when I personally bring it up, like, hey guys, if Black Lives Matter, then how come we're not talking about this problem? Then the Black on Black crime, it appears, just gets a pass because, well, the reason Black people are, like that is also that's due to systemic racism. which is something I have a hard time understanding and processing, that systemic racism is the reason blacks are killing each other. That's usually how the logic sounds, at least to me, when I'm hearing it. So now this, of course, this is, if I'm just presenting an angle here, I wouldn't necessarily put all faith in this angle of vision that I'm presenting either. I would like to make actually a more maybe subtle point. And the point is that how do you know what information you're receiving is actually true information anymore? First of all, let's be real. Most of us are not going to do the hard work that it takes to actually come to discover the truth of something. And the biggest problem in our attempt to discovering truth happens to be our own prejudices. We're attached to certain narratives and we're against certain other narratives. That's just the way that duality works in this world, attachment and aversion. And so according to our prejudices, we find ourselves credulously means just very willing to believe one sort of narrative and completely incredulous when hearing opposite information. Coming back to my example, when I bring up the black on black crime as being the biggest problem in the black demographic in the USA, I'm often met with incredulity. Like, how could you even say that? Why would you even believe that? And even if it's true, it's due to systemic racism. Whereas when it comes to the narratives that we encounter in the mainstream media, such as recently the George Floyd case and earlier the Trayvon Martin case, which was said now by the Black Lives Matter to be the motivation for their organization, his case, his death, and the acquittal of the officer who killed him. If you have to they're very willing to believe a certain narrative that is presented, even one that's not very well researched, and they're very incredulous to believe any information that's opposing that prejudice of theirs. And we all have our prejudice. This is not actually meant to be a criticism. It's more just a recognition of human nature, that we're attached and averse to certain things, and therefore we demonstrate a real tendency to just believe anything that's in line with my prejudice, and a real tendency to disbelieve, no matter how thorough some evidence is shown to us, a tendency to disbelieve it if it's not aligned with my prejudice. Just one final point, because I'm talking a lot here. With the Trayvon Martin case, for example, which is the catalyst according to the new Black Lives Matter website, and I want to emphasize the new Black Lives Matter website because I started following Black Lives Matter in 2017, early 2017. And at that time, their website had stated that they were largely an LGBT movement, preoccupied specifically with the lives of Black trans women and lesbians. But and I do have evidence for that. I mean, the website has been updated since then. And it's not that an organization can't grow and develop, but I just find it interesting that their website earlier didn't really have much to say about the deaths of Black men, which is the narrative that's popular now. They were more into LGBT issues. So how they go for that focus to the new focus, that's something that's very interesting for me also. It appears to be some level of deception going on, for me at least. But anyway, taking for granted that this Trayvon Martin case was an actual inspiration for them, if you go and investigate the Trayvon Martin case, there's a lot of discrepancy there. And there have been a lot of documentaries, YouTube videos done to show that the narrative that is popular amongst Black Lives Matter movement and mostly the societal mind in the US don't actually match the facts of what actually happened in that Trayvon Martin case. So when you're trying to navigate this situation, I find that this is the hardest part about it. How do you know what is true anymore? When the whole world's the sort of truthfulness moral of humanity is severely compromised, and so many people are telling lies. Fake news is like actually a really real thing, and manipulating narratives is a really real thing. How do you know what information is true, what information is false? And then on top of that, how do you try to navigate this world of falsity when you have your own prejudices that make you inclined to believe some things and disinclined to believe other things, not because they're true or false, but because they don't match your prejudices. So when you take all of this together, it becomes it becomes very confusing to know what is actually the truth of it. So I largely don't think the Black Lives Matter narrative is a very truthful one. I think it's if it is a genuine movement, it may have been hijacked for nefarious purposes, and it's causing the United States, of course, to become extremely divided, and all of this may be based on stuff that's not actually indeed true.
There's also this narrative around any critique towards the Black Lives Matter movement implies that you don't think that Black Lives Matter.
That's so interesting to me.
They adopted a bulletproof name that any sort of criticism that's flung their way immediately makes you a racist.
Yeah, I find that to be fascinating. For example, if Black Lives Matter, what about the lives of Black police officers? Over the last week, I've heard that there were at least two, I think, two Black police officers that were killed in the riots that were happening in the United States. Now, I haven't fully researched that, so you have to take this with a grain of salt, as I'm suggesting in my first comment. But if this were true, I was wondering about their Black lives. They have Black lives, and they're they may be married to Black people, and they may have Black children, and now they have to live without their father or their mother. So did their Black lives matter also when they were killed by rioters who are probably likely to be Black, or else I would suspect they were Black, because if they were white, then that wouldn't be good at all. And so did their Black lives matter? It's so interesting that the modern world prides itself off of being like developed and advanced and intelligent, and yet when you question anything, you can be immediately censored because it doesn't match a particular narrative. Even for someone like me, I have a Black male body, so my Black life should matter too. My Black voice should matter. I've been saying this thing on Instagram talking about tell Black stories. Oh, unless their Black story doesn't match the narrative, then they should be censored. And I've been chastised by my own friends, many of whom are of different races, because I don't have a voice that kind of matches the sort of what I would deem to be a sort of trauma-centered story around my Blackness. And if I don't have such a story, or if I'm not in line with the sort of narrative that is popular or winning the day, then my Black voice and my Black experience isn't really as important. So I just find that I guess because the topic has been so politicized, then if your message really is Black Lives Matter, which I'm having my doubts about that, but if it is, it's become eclipsed by the politics surrounding the issue, which has become primary and not the actual purpose of the thing, to share Black lives and their experiences and their voices and so on.
Yeah. There's also something I've noted that I really feel that most people have the intention of having a just and fair world.
Yes.
And that, of course, is not the world we live in. And it is many times like really violently painful that it is so. But where I don't disagree, where I disagree with many recent movements, not only around race but around LGBT stuff, is that they want that the glass through which we see history and the present, that we should see the world through the glass of differences. Like, you're gay, you're trans, you're lesbian, you're black, you're Indian, you're white, you're male, you're female. And I don't see that working because as humans, we are much more prone to devalue lives that we feel different to ours. So I think um the real way, and this sounds a little childish, but it was Martin Luther King's way, as far as I can tell, is to find whatever makes us whatever makes us all humans. Like, we should seek for the ways that we are the same, although all of us have different experiences, black, white, poor, rich, and we should strive towards everyone having as much the same opportunity to have a fulfilled life in this world. But I really see that lens through which these movements are trying to come about change, that it will backfire on them, because if you push and push and push people's differences upon them, then that's what people will see, and as a side effect, you will tend as a human to devalue what is different from you.
Yes. So this is a very fascinating point. The way the Bhagavad Gita or Eastern spirituality solves this issue is by informing humanity that we're actually not this material body, but that we're pure unadulterated consciousness having a human experience. And not only is the consciousness in the human species, but the consciousness is in all life forms. So it's found in the aquatic life forms, the plant life forms, the reptile life forms, insect, bird life forms, the mammals, and then, of course, humans. And the nature of consciousness is uniform. Just keeping it simple, consciousness is understood to be, the Sanskrit is Sat Chit Ananda. So the word Sat means that consciousness exists, it is. And Chit means it's aware. It's characterized by awareness, unlike the computers that we're using to have this conversation, which aren't aware, or the shirts that we wear, or the pants that we have on, they're not aware. So even though the shirt exists, it's not aware. So consciousness it exists, and it's also aware. And on top of that, it is Ananda. Ananda means, generally it's translated as bliss. And when referring to the soul, it means devoid of misery. Also, there's the non-existence of misery in the soul as his very nature. So this is said to be the nature of all conscious entities, whether they inhabit the human species or the animal species or the reptile species or the insect species. This is the nature of consciousness. So our nature is uniform, or just using simple language, our nature is one. We have one nature, and our bodies are different. And we acquire different bodies according to the results of previous activities performed. The basic idea in Bhagavad Gita is that if you perform pious activities or virtuous activities, then you prepare your future life to be very good. And if you perform vicious activities, then your future life will be not very good. So the differences that we see in the unfairness, the differences that you spoke of in your comment, for the Bhagavad Gita, well, those differences are due to karma. And karma really means the merit of your own work. So it's like if you didn't study for the test and you get an F, and then you say, I can't believe I got an F. What do you mean you can't believe you got an F? You didn't study. You got the result of your work, or in this case, your not work. And of course, if you studied very well, then you get the result of that, and you may have gotten an A. So the idea of karma is that you get you're getting the results of your work, the merit of your work. And so if you see someone having a nice position for this doctrine, and this applies to most Eastern spirituality, that means that in some previous life, there was the performance of meritorious work. And if you're finding yourself in a more difficult situation, then there was some transgression or improprieties performed previously. So that's how they try to account for the differences that we see in nature. But despite those differences, they have the metaphysics that we're actually all consciousness. We're all having the same nature internally, or, internally means inside the body, which we're inhabiting. And if we learn to develop our awareness of that true self, the true conscious entity, then despite our differences, we would be able to learn respect, knowing that our true worth is not actually in the body that we're inhabiting, which is like a mere vehicle, but the actual value is in the actual conscious entity, the real person, the soul. So it's like seeing someone driving a Mercedes Benz and someone else driving a Toyota. And if you think of them in terms of their car, then the guy who has a Mercedes Benz will be valued higher than the guy driving a Toyota Corolla. But if you're looking at them as just humans, then on the platform of humanity, they're the same, even though someone has a nicer car than the other one. So if you look at our bodies like cars, and this is how the Bhagavad Gita would instruct us, or most Eastern spirituality instructs in this way. If you see the bodies as cars, okay, so this car is a little bit, different than that one. This one is poor. That one is richer. This one is more beautiful. That one, not so much. This one's this color. This other car is that color. They're actually all just cars. But the real worth is not in the car. It's in the driver of the car, consciousness, which is one. Then you can circumvent the problems that come up from the differences, or you can learn how to reconcile them. Because let's be real, you don't want everyone to be exactly the same. Equality, first of all, is not materially possible to achieve, nor would you want it. Imagine if all parts of our body did exactly the same thing. Then we would have a real problem. We actually like the head to function like a head, don't we? We like the arms to function like arms and the legs to function like legs. So when you think of the world like a social body, so you have some people who are like the head of the social body. They're like the intelligentsia, for example. Then you have those who may be the arms of the social body, say warriors. I'm reluctant to say government because they don't really protect anyone. And then say you have the legs of the social body, the laboring class, and so on. These are differences, but you actually appreciate those differences because they help the social body work. In the same way that you like the different functions of your own body because it helped the whole body. So those differences can become an asset, provided that you don't hold contempt because of those differences. And the way that the Eastern spirituality tries to get around that contempt is by teaching everyone to think of themselves as consciousness and not as material bodies. As soon as you come away from that metaphysics and you adopt the metaphysics that I'm actually the material body itself, then the scene of differences is unavoidable. And the dissension that differences often bring up is also likely to be unavoidable. The only way you could actually avoid this is that you have to have a deeper metaphysics. As using your language, we have to see what makes us human. That was the metaphysics that you brought up. For the Gita, it's not that even we are human, but actually that we're consciousness. So not only do we value humans, but we also value other species of life because we see the same conscious entity inside that life. So without a deeper metaphysics, you're going to have the terrible slaughter of animals. You're going to have your ecological problems, their lack of respect for nature, and then, of course, naturally, the lack of respect for other humans. So people tend to gloss over the importance of having a metaphysics to navigate these issues. But I like to bring up the reality that if you don't have a deep metaphysics to underpin your understanding of what's going on, then you're likely to just repeat tragically and to some degree comedically the same thing that we've seen throughout history.
I'm going to try to map on what my beliefs are on top of that.
Okay.
And then ask some, I hope, relevant questions.
Yeah, let's hear it.
I agree almost perfectly that consciousness is the relevant factor when we are trying to see ourselves as others, not only other humans but other beings in this world. And I think that consciousness is the most important value the universe has. And regarding soul, or if there's a part of that consciousness that transcends our human experience or our actual body, I am pretty much agnostic about that. I'm really, I don't have enough evidence from my perspective to fall on either side of that argument, but I can totally see how, even if you have this this belief, and you can even have it as a metaphor, that there is some divine spark within you that is equal to all other divine sparks, that they have the same source and they have the same nature, then that makes you the same as everyone else. Or maybe I didn't say that right. It doesn't make you the same, but there is a shared something
Yes.
between you and everything else alive.
Yes.
And I really like that, and I have that in a way from my secular perspective. I do believe that consciousness is that spark, and I am just mystified by it. I don't know where it comes from. I know there are different explanations within the philosophical world, the religious world, and the scientific world as to whether it comes from matter or it precedes matter, and I am still in the search of understanding that, and I have made up my mind. Not that it matters. The universe doesn't care if I if I make up my mind or not, but it matters to me. So I think we share almost all of our intuitions there. But then I can see that there is a way also in which, if you believe that life is, and this is probably a really rudimentary comment, but if you believe life, or human life, repeats itself indefinitely, then what is the motivating factor, or the motive? Where do you find motivation to do anything about lives that aren't good? I'm using air quotes right now, but no one can see me. um, where does that motivation come from executing changes in the material world that end up impacting the well-being of beings that we can see and know are here right now?
Yes. So I'm just reflecting what I heard, but accepting that consciousness is fundamental, and that having that view of consciousness, whether it's a religious view or just an intuition or even just a cultural view, will very much help us in creating a unity amongst the variety that we encounter in the world. So we kind of share that together. Having said that,
Yes.
if consciousness is continuously dying and taking rebirth in this world, then where is the motivation to do good, basically, and engage in a way that is healthy and transformative for the world that's right in front of you and that you can see in the right now? Am I hearing that properly?
Yes, that is the question.
Yeah. So the idea here, at least for the Gita, for a lot of Eastern traditions, is that we have, again, the situation that we have, whether it's good or bad, according to our previous good or bad activities. So even if for benefiting your own consciousness, like in a sort of selfish way, with this understanding, the idea was that you will do good works so that in the future you can get a good or even better position than you have now. In other words, precisely out of selfishness, you might be inspired to perform good activities, knowing that such activities will improve your life situation, even dramatically. It was very common, at least in India, even to this day, where people don't believe in like an ultimate transcendent reality, but they believe in a higher celestial domain, even within this material world. So right now we're on the earth plane, and underneath the earth there's a subterranean sort of dimension, and above the earth there's a celestial dimension. And there's a certain group of Eastern philosophers. They don't really believe in the transcendence beyond this world, but they do believe in a celestial world. And so they encourage the performance of good works so that you can not only enjoy prosperity in this life, but then you can go to a celestial dimension to enjoy even greater sort of pleasures and delights. So even with that understanding, there would be some encouragement to do good. I think what you might be getting at also is that it's precisely for those who have a more transcendent understanding of consciousness, and that ultimate reality as we know it is ultimately to be transcended, and we're to go back to like a spiritual domain, leaving aside the material world altogether. Then the idea is that, well, what good with that sort of consciousness? What about the here and now and doing good for the here and now? Am I right in assuming this?
Yes, it's.
I've heard this criticism before. People who are like really.
Yes, I know. That's why you said it's rudimentary.
No, it's not rudimentary. It's actually an interesting question, because I even heard one monk, he was sharing that they did some sort of poll, and it was discovered that those who have a sort of transcendent understanding of their spirituality, they appear to be less empathic or less compassionate than those who kind of had just more of a secular view of the world. And I found that interesting. I think that speaks to exactly your question. Yeah, because if, ultimate reality is beyond this world, who gives a shit about this world? let it do its thing. I'm going back to a spiritual reality. So, there's that sense of it. And is this correct? Am I?
Yes, it's around that notion that that maybe it feels less pressing to exact change right now, if you believe that you will be coming back here maybe thousands or maybe almost infinite times, whatever you consider as you. Right. And I just can't reconcile those.
Yeah, well, I guess if I had to, I'm going to try to answer this question using the Bhagavad Gita. The world of matter is not a very nice world. I think you probably have experience of that already.
Yes.
The Gita refers to the world as dukkhalayam ashashratam, and the word dukkhalayam means a house of dukkha. Just like this word Himalaya, I'm sure your audience have heard of the Himalaya mountains. So the word alaya means house. Hima means snow. So the Himalaya means house of snow. So the matter world is called Dukkhalaya, which means house of dukkha. Dukkha means misery or suffering. And Krishna also says in Bhagavad Gita, asukam anityam lokam, that this world is asukam. You will not find happiness here. You'll find pleasure. That's a little bit different, but you're not going to find happiness. And even if you, for argument's sake, will say, no, that's not true, I have found. So then Krishna says, well, ashashratam. Ashashratam means it's temporary. And the very fact that it's temporary is itself a miserable point, because you get attached to something that gives you pleasure. That's natural. And when that attachment is taken away from you for whatever reasons, you suffer. I'm sure you have the experience, or your audience may have the experience of falling in love. I always say the tragic experience of falling in love for the first time. And, this is my everything and blah, 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 all that sort of infatuation that goes on with that. And then you break up for whatever reason. and the pain is like terrible. According to the nature of the attachment, of course. If you're not very attached, you have less pain. But if you were very attached, then you have a lot of pain. So the very fact that the material world is temporary is itself a cause of suffering, depending on the degree of attachment that you have for things in this world. So at least for Gita, well, most Eastern spirituality, in fact, the purpose is not to go on reincarnating life after life after life. That process is itself considered suffering. I don't think you're looking forward to death. I'm just going to assume that. I know there are people out here who will be,
I am not.
there are people out here who will be fake. I'm not afraid of death. And you pull a gun out there, like, please don't shoot me, please don't shoot me.
Yes.
So death is something that's not something we're looking forward to, but it's something that's part of our life experience. And especially the way the world is wilding out, we could die in any sort of crazy way at any moment, it seems. So death is something that's not a very nice experience. And it's really at the heart of the matter world. Whether it's a sort of death of the physical body or even a death of a certain identity, right? Sometimes when you change religions, you experience an ego death. You change relationships, you might experience an ego death. You change careers, you might experience it. There's so many ways we experience death in this world, and all the experiences are not very pleasurable at all, to say the least. So the general motivation, at least for Eastern spirituality, is to stop this process by which you have to keep experiencing death again and again and again. They call these paths the paths of liberation. So, so just to your question, or just an aspect of it, we're not trying to take birth again and again and again. That's problematic, at least for the reasons that I've just mentioned. We suffer. The idea is to put an end to that. And so the idea of doing work ultimately is so you can put an end to your suffering. And when you come to that understanding of activity, then it is natural, at least for Eastern spirituality, it's natural that you come to the point of wanting to transcend this world altogether. So at first you do good works in this world so that if you take birth in the future, you'll have a good situation. But then realizing that it doesn't really matter if you have a good or bad situation in one sense, because you have to continuously experience death in this world. Then one comes to the idea of, well, is there some sort of work I can do to get out of this world or out of this matter state? And then that becomes the sort of good work that needs to go on. Does that begin? So, of course, that's taking a certain paradigm of life into consideration. But I would frankly say that whether whether one is agnostic or, religious or spiritual, whatever, everyone is more or less trying to perform activities by which they can decrease their suffering and augment their happiness.
Yeah.
So once you understand, go.
That maps on perfectly to my worldview. It's just for some reason I just think that that tragedy that life is, where there is suffering and there is pleasure and there is well-being, that's just how it is. We have to accept it, and there will never be some state in which we are completely free from that. I know that's like those are just like different intuitions that you and I have, and I believe that they are almost irreconcilable.
Not at all. I don't think they're irreconcilable at all. I get it just comes. We also say that tragedy and pleasure and pain, and so that's just the way this matter world is. So then our question comes to, what is the true nature of the self? That's why, again, for most Eastern spirituality, consciousness is ontologically different from matter. That's indicated simply by the fact that we have awareness, as I mentioned earlier, whereas matter doesn't have awareness. Like our computers, for example, a composite of matter doesn't have awareness. And our body itself is made of the same elements, more or less, as our computer or any other object in this world. So our body itself also doesn't have awareness by its intrinsic nature. So where does that awareness come from? For example, when there's death, then the body is still there, composed of the same elements, but there's no awareness anymore. So where did the awareness go? Now that's where, who can say? When you're an agnostic, who can say? But at least coming to the understanding that there is a very distinct difference between consciousness and the world of matter as we know it. So then Eastern spirituality tries to discover what is the nature of that consciousness different from matter. And I wonder, because you said there's no way we can get out of a state of misery. I really wonder if that's true, because when persons go into deep states of meditation, where their sense of identity, even with their material body, is suspended. I'll even give you an example without meditation. If you've ever had a surgery and you go to the dentist to get a root canal, and they put you under anesthesia, right? So your body is there, but you have no awareness of what's going on until you come back to the external body. Even though your consciousness is still inhabiting the body, therefore you didn't die, but somehow you had no awareness of what was happening to the physical body. You had no awareness of the mind states under anesthesia. You had no awareness even of your sense of identity as a man or as a woman or as this or that. It was like completely suspended under anesthesia. And yet you were there. There was still awareness. And it was awareness devoid of content, and it was awareness devoid of misery. So the Eastern spiritualities, they kind of want to know, what is that? How is it that I can have such an experience even while inhabiting the psychophysical apparatus, the body, and have?
I want to know too. I want to know. I want to know too. That's the most pressing question in my life for the last, I don't know how long, but it has to be really long. But I wanted to say that I had this discussion yesterday with a friend.
Okay.
And I am really happy I'm being able to have it with you, because I was asking him this yesterday. I was saying there is this something, and it's really hard to put your finger on it, that is different, and we don't know where it comes from. And the fact that it exists is a complete mystery to me.
Yes.
And then and I would say, you know what awareness is. There is the fact of you having an experience. That experience exists. And he would and I would say, and he would say, I would ask him, there's a difference between a rock and you. And he would say, no, those are just different levels of consciousness or of awareness. The rock is aware in a level I can't understand. And I would say yes, thankfully. And I would just say, yes, but that's where words and meaning break down. Because if I can't speak to the difference of me or a dog and a rock, then there is no use for language, because then everything is everything, and then everything is nothing at the same time.
Yeah, not that there's no use for language, but it has its limitations, like anything in the matter world. Everything in the matter world has limitation. And so if consciousness, well, this is the premise, of course, of Eastern spirituality. If consciousness is ontologically different from matter, and you can say more subtle than matter, or you can beyond matter, then it makes sense that language would not be able to describe it precisely. In other words, language can describe things empirically that are within matter. Empirically means they can be measured, they can be seen, they can be manipulated in various ways. You can describe that. But if working with the premise of the Gita and other Eastern spirituality, if consciousness is beyond matter, then naturally language has its limitations, as well as our ability to think about it. Because for Eastern spirituality, the mind is also part of matter. Intelligence is also part of matter. Of course, ego and identity, that is also part of matter. So all these faculties that we use to understand the world empirically are useless when it comes to a world that may be beyond the empirical reality. And so it just breaks down. It's just limited. At least
Yeah.
that's how we would. In fact, the language that Krishna uses in Gita is achintya. You've been using the word mystifying. Krishna uses the word achintya. And the word achintya means that it cannot be understood by one's unaided faculties of understanding. So our faculties of understanding are the senses, the mind, and the intelligence. Those are our faculties for understanding. Krishna says, well, the consciousness is achintya, that if your faculties are not aided, then they will not be able to understand that reality that is beyond empiricism. And so, well, how do we understand that? Well, there's basically two methods that Eastern spirituality takes. One is that they accept a scripture that speaks of it, but you can say more important than just a scripture that speaks of it, they accept a process by which that can be experienced in its own right. A process of yoga or a process of meditation by which they can come to experience the true nature of the soul, devoid of its connection with the psychophysical apparatus. Anyway, so I just wanted to speak to how the Gita might explain why language breaks down when it comes to, and why science can't put their finger on it after all these years.
I'm still hopeful it will be able to.
Go on hoping.
I know, but yeah, I can see I can see a way in which consciousness is ontologically different from matter.
Yes.
But I haven't thrown in the trash the idea that it can be just an emergent property of matter. And I know there's a lot of philosophy and study about this point, and it's become more relevant recently. But I think we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
And but let's turn away to something else. I don't want to lose my audience on the intricacies of consciousness.
Yes.
Okay, so I wanted to move on.
Something more drama filled, some drama.
Yeah, a little more drama. I wanted to move on or also touch on the subject of religion. Do you have time? I'm not sure if
I do.
Yeah. Okay. So if you have to get out at any time, you just let me know.
All right.
Okay. But I wanted to touch on a related subject to whatever we've been speaking about, and that's the topic of religion itself. Like you can separate discussions from metaphysics from let's say the structure and organized religion as an entity here in this matter world that humans participate in.
Yes.
And like my take on religion as an atheist is not, I don't think it's the most common, but if there are any biology enthusiasts out there, or evolutionary biology enthusiasts, I'm more aligned with David Sloan Wilson's take on it than Richard Dawkins. Do you know who Richard Dawkins is?
Yes, of course.
Okay, so I don't align really well with Richard Dawkins' take on religion. I don't think it's a mind virus, and but I do see it as just like a human structure that has served that serves a purpose in human communities, in human social structures, and I think it has tremendous benefits that we can talk about, but I also see that it has some detriments that are difficult to get away from. Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, from the Eastern paradigm of these things, religion, you can say in a sense there's a distinction between religion and spirituality. Religion has as its preoccupation the matter world, actually, how to follow certain rules and rituals by which you can be happy in this world, and of course after death enjoy in a heavenly region. And again, for Eastern spirituality, there's this sense of a celestial world within the matter world where enjoyment is more, and it's not spiritual, it's material. So for the East, you have religion, which is largely preoccupied with living a good moral life, and getting the result of such a um, virtuous life by having facilities by which you can enjoy in this world, and then after death you can go to heaven. Spirituality, in a sense, is coming to the point of trying to discover who you are as consciousness, which was our last discussion. Like that being your primary concern, trying to understand what is the actual conscious entity, maybe trying to also discover where that entity came from, if it's coming from anywhere. And the work of that discovery was known as yoga, basically. At least if we're using the language of the Gita, it's called yoga, which is the work of realizing who that conscious entity is. What is that unifying spark of the divine, or however, whatever language you want to use? What is that? How can I be situated in that awareness constantly? That is the work of spirituality. So religion, I mean, for those who are having their suspicions about religion or organizations, it's fair. It's understandable. Religion does serve a function for human societies to organize them, to insist upon a sort of moral way of living. Although there is a sense that you can be moral without religion, I don't know if the modern world has really proven that very effectively, because people largely aren't religious and they're not very moral either. So there's a sense of a religion serving a sort of, at least minimally, a cultural function to keep human society from degrading very rapidly. Even though there has been, of course, scandals and all these things, but largely it serves a function of keeping humans accountable, even to one another, and to a sense of a greater something beyond them. But the focus of religion may not actually be a spiritual one. So there's a distinction there. And because its preoccupation is mostly material, it's like, it suffers from being materially corrupted and so on. It becomes uninspiring in many ways.
Yeah.
As is the nature of the world of matter. It's uninspiring ultimately.
Yeah. I want to put a pin on us getting back to where scripture fits into between these two, but first I want to talk about what you mentioned there regarding morality, and let's say like moral prescriptions between or as the main purpose of religion, and I do see it in sort of a way like that. It has many purposes, social cohesion and sharing a belief gives you that sense of oneness that we were talking before as well. Like that's an intermediate step that you can have. Like if you share a religion with someone, you can in some way see him or her as your brother or sister.
Yes.
So I see that as a really relevant purpose for religion. But regarding morality, I'm a true believer that morality can come from a different place than religion, and from a different place than belief in God. But we'll get to that later. But what do you think about religions having different moral prescriptions? Because there's a sense right now, and I'm pretty sure we're going to share this intuition, that all cultures and therefore all religions are equal, and that is not at all my sense of the religious world. I think it's really bullshit that's trying to appease people's sensitivities. But if you were really to read what each religion's texts are, you cannot in any way equate
No, you cannot.
Christianity, Islam, and Jainism.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well,
am I gonna get you in trouble?
no, 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 not at all. So the question is about why there are differences with the moral prescriptions of religions. This is the specific question we're zooming in on.
Yeah, and is there a sense that we can say that the moral prescriptions of one religion, or specific moral prescriptions within a religion, are bad, are inciting of suffering in humanity and the people that follow them and the people that are um that suffer the consequences of those moral prescriptions?
Yeah, okay. These are all very big questions, and we'll gloss over some. I'll just share some few thoughts. The first one is, where does morality come from? Wherever it comes from, it must be metaphysical, because morals are metaphysical. When you think of something like justice, right? You can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it. It's literally beyond the physical world, and yet it's an idea, at least, that people believe in. So when you're when you're trying to understand morality, you have to use you intuit metaphysical causes of metaphysical principles that we have. Just like, in other words, you can't really derive moral principles by looking at physical things first, right? It's not that by looking at the biology of a human being that you derive a particular moral from that. It just kind of tells you.
I'm gonna disagree there, but
Yeah.
yeah, keep going. I'll get to it later.
Yeah, well, we have to talk about that then. Can you derive morals from physical things? Because otherwise, it might be relative. Someone says like this, someone says like that, precisely because morals tend to, because they're metaphysical. They're not as physical. They're not as easily subjected to empirical analysis as gross physical objects.
I see morality
Yeah.
as deriving from two main values. One is well-being, and the other one is suffering.
Well-being and suffering, right?
Well,
Which are,
well-being can be as wide a net as you want it to be. Like, it doesn't have to be immediate pleasure,
yeah,
but it can be your sense of worth. It can be satisfaction in life, satisfaction as to what your
yeah,
deeds have been.
yeah,
And then and I can see how those two are just they are axioms, like they are just things taken out of some place.
yes,
But the fact that consciousness exists, that awareness exists,
yeah,
and that consciousness can have either experiences that tend more towards suffering or more towards well-being, I think that is like the framework from where you have to build up, and then justice and other more more virtuous morals
yeah.
have to come from those two opposites.
Yes. We can agree there, but even well-being, I do agree with that. But even well-being and suffering, these two entities along, or categories, they're also quite metaphysical. How one understands what is well-being. It's hard to derive. Of course, there's certain things like if you cut off your arm, you're going to suffer.
Place a hand on a stove,
Yeah,
on a on a stove that's on, and you can tell the difference
yeah.
from
But
suffering and not suffering.
you're right. So, but deriving like a moral, because you see some people, they're masochistic or whatever, some sort of psychosis is there, and they may derive
Mm,
some sort of pleasure even from suffering. Or even in religious
yeah.
organizations, they often derive some sort of satisfaction from like repentance, and they may like self-flagellate themselves and do all sorts of things, feeling that that's part of the well-being. So
Mm,
that's why I'm saying that when you're navigating morals, they're quite metaphysical. And you're going from like one metaphysical thing, such as well-being and even suffering to some degree, and you're deriving another metaphysical idea from that. So that's kind of like the starting point of where morals come in for me, at least. They're clearly metaphysical entities. And you can intuit certain metaphysical ideas from physical things. But even how you're defining what is well-being and suffering is going to be quite intangible. And you can argue about it. That's what philosophers do. They write big, big books and they argue about these things. So with that starting point, it appears to me that morality has as its target audience people who are living in this world. So how to live in this world in such a way that it increases well-being and decreases suffering. And so when you look at the varieties of cultures, their food, their language, even the shapes of their bodies, their colors, all these things, that it is natural that they derive different understandings of what is well-being and what will increase well-being, what decreases suffering, according to these sort of considerations, the considerations of their surroundings, their culture, their food, etc. And at least for the Bhagavad Gita, and well, this is again, most Eastern spirituality, they definitely do not accept that they're equal, because nothing in this world is equal. The sense of equality for at least Eastern spirituality is a metaphysical insight. It's not a material fact. Materially, everything is unequal. That's obvious. That's obvious to our eyes that it's unequal. And when it comes to like cultures and their morals, there is a sort of sentimental sense that everyone's thing is, good, because it's good for them. It doesn't really matter. That's an interesting idea. For the Bhagavad Gita, that isn't accepted because everything in this world can be categorized in terms of, I'm going to try to gloss this as simply and quickly as possible. But the way that the psychophysical world evolves itself is that you have these different forces of nature. You have a sort of sustaining force of nature called the mode of goodness. You have a creative force of nature called the mode of passion. And you have a destructive force of nature called the mode of ignorance. And you can see this with your own two eyes. There's a force that brings about creation. Even in our own psychologies, you see these different forces at play. A more creative time in our life, a more destructive time in our life, or even in our day. And then like a time where you're like sustaining and maintaining things very well. So the whole world is understood in terms of these different forces of nature, or you can call them modes of nature. And there are three of them. So if you were to take three, it's just like if you have three primary colors, and you were to take those three primary colors and mix them together, you can get 9 colors. And if you take those 9 colors and mix them together, you can get 81 colors. And then 81 into 81, I'm bad at math, so that's the extent of my math there. And you get this whole variety of colors by mixing these, fundamentally just these 3 primary colors together. So in Eastern spirituality, they say these forces of nature, they kind of combine and recombine and recombine to create all the psychological and physical variety that we see in the whole cosmos. So for them, the whole cosmos is a combination of these 3 modes or these 3 forces of nature. So although everything in this world has a combination of these modes, a certain mode can be prominent in a person's, let's say, psychology, for example, right? For example, some of us have a more, let's say, goodness mind. So we're into like certain types of food. We're into like, let's say, rising early in the morning, maybe meditating, maybe reading a book. Again, goodness relates to sustaining. Then you have a more destructive force of nature. For example, certain type of music talking about killing people and, hurting people. I don't even want to go there. Like I'm thinking about trap music, trap rap, particularly. Like going back to the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm like, how come y'all not calling out this ghetto music, yo? Y'all talking about the black community suffering from police. Look, this music is glorifying like killing people. Anyway, so you can see that in that mentality, there's more of the ignorance force at play, which deals with destruction. And then you have the more creative or passionate force where people are just talking about sex, talking about making money, talking about how much they have. That's a more passionate force in nature. So everything in this world can be categorized in terms of these different forces or modes of nature. The food that you eat, you You know what spoiled food looks like. That's in the mode of ignorance. You know what freshly cooked food with proper spice, proper spicing that doesn't that helps to nourish your body. You know what that feels like when you've eaten it and smelled it and seen it. You have food that's more passionate, it's so spicy that it hurts going in and it hurts coming out. So anything in this world you can categorize into these different modes. So also cultures and religions can also be viewed in terms of these different modes of nature by dominance. For example, if you have a religion where in their teaching there's a lot of emphasis on killing disbelievers. I ain't calling out any particular religion, but there are religions out there like that where that's the where that is a pretty big emphasis, and people in their naivete, they just think that all religion really is teaching about is love and God is love. I'm like, not exactly. Not everyone is teaching about love. Some people, there's a teaching that you kill disbelievers. So you can understand, at least using the schema of the modes, that religion has a more ignorance force in it. Ignorance being the force that is more destructive in nature. Then you have religions or spiritualities that teach, that you should love your fellow man and you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So this is obviously a more sattvic force or more goodness force predominating in that particular tradition. So like that, also morals that come up in different cultures, because again, morals are governing different cultures. So if a culture is more tamasic or ignorant in nature, then they'll have morals that are also more ignorant in nature. If a culture is more passionate in nature, they'll have morals. Just like now in the Western world, it's a kind of moral that success is based on getting more, being at the top of everyone, having a lot. This is a more passionate, and only if you can contribute to the contribution of this expansion, then you are considered to be maybe a good person. Otherwise, there's some sort of impropriety there. But okay, that's a more passionate moral because you have a very passionate culture. So yeah, definitely morals are not viewed equally, nor are cultures viewed equally for Eastern spirituality. What is viewed equally is the consciousness that's underneath all of this. And that's why that's such an important metaphysics for all these traditions.
Yeah, there are a couple of points there I want to make. First, when you critique ideas, you're not critiquing people. You're just critiquing ideas.
Right.
That's something that somehow escapes people's minds right now, and you can't critique a set of ideas without being racist or misogynist or whatever. Right. And the second thing there is that when I say just what you said, I obviously say it in different words because that's not my worldview or my tradition. Right. But usually what I get back is you see cultures as differently because you belong to this white patriarchy that that feels itself on top of others and looks down on other cultures. So I'm really glad that you are showing how, from a different perspective, you can arrive at the same sense that not all moral prescriptions are equal. I cannot fathom how people can have that in their minds and then go out and say, hey, you have to respect LGBT people. Like, right. Wouldn't you be able to just answer, hey, that's just Christian religion. You're supposed to burn witches at the stake.
Right. Supposed to own slaves.
And yeah, or slavery is justified in what in the Old Testament as well.
Leviticus or whatever.
Yeah. So what I from my point of view, like I'm going to try to show you how I got to the same perspective.
Yeah.
From my two axioms, suffering and well-being, some moral prescriptions, some some normative arguments lead to obvious more suffering in humans than others do. Like I'm gonna use your same example. If you say kill anyone who doesn't believe in my God or my prophet, then that is something that I see that you can objectively question and say that does not lead to well-being, or translated into your terms, that is obviously not in the mode of goodness of the world.
Right.
But there's this fear right now that if you argument against anything that is different from you, it's because you have these biases. And of course that's true in many cases, but there has to be space for us to think about our common humanity, our common intuitions as to how to get the world better, and be able to say, hey, I know it's your culture, but putting women in black bags and not letting them see the world, or the world see them, does not lead to a better world, no matter how much you want it to be, or how respectful you want to be. We have to be able to criticize bad ideas, and I just think that there are many of those, not only in the religion we are speaking about right now, but in many religions. And I wanted to ask you a point there, because we were speaking about religions as a whole, but I can definitely see how we can parse out goodness and badness within religious scriptures, and how can religious people deal with that? How can, like, I know it's easy to see it in other people's scriptures, but the way you see, I imagine you see the Bhagavad Gita. It's difficult comparing the Bhagavad Gita to other scriptures, but like, is there a way of reforming scripture, or just bettering people's understanding of whatever a scripture says as a metaphor? Because I feel that there's just this inherent danger to a book that is supposed to be holy, saying that you have to kill people. Like, I have
a hard time with that.
How you get around that?
I don't know,
because the literal interpretation is always just available.
Yes. Well, you don't. I think what happens for individuals, all of us, and I mentioned this at the outset of our little conversation, is that we all suffer from our prejudices. And so we become very credulous with certain things and very incredulous with other things. The things that support my belief or faith, I'm like, yeah, this is it. And things that like question it or put it to question, you're just like, how can you even say that? You know, you just don't want to consider those uncomfortable things. And so that is something that because of being human, and because of necessarily having our various prejudices and predilections, this is a problem that, you know, everyone will encounter. Unless, you know, for me on a personal level, someone's going to ask, well, do you encounter that problem with like the Bhagavad Gita, for example? And the first thing that came to my mind was like, nah, because the Gita is like flawless. And that's not my bias speaking at all. Really, it isn't. I promise. I think what I appreciate about the Bhagavad Gita, which is why I would probably categorize it more as like a spiritual literature than a religious one, is that the Gita is not like prescriptive in the same sense that we're accustomed to hearing about in other religions. It kind of talks about broad principles, like I've just mentioned, for example, the modes of nature. That's something that you can see happening everywhere. The creative force, the destructive force, the sustaining force. You see that happening everywhere. You see it happening in your own mind. You see it happening on the TV shows that you watch. You see it in the music, the food. You can see it everywhere. And understanding those principles, you yourself can even intuit what things are going to be good, what things are not going to be so good. You know, eating food that is, tamasic ignorance is not going to be as healthy for the body as eating food that's more goodness, for example. So you have Krishna kind of like talking like these broad principles. What is the soul? And how is the soul different from the body? And then you can kind of derive your own, I wouldn't say your own, but it becomes easier to navigate what's going to bring well-being using your language about morality, and what's going to be destructive because just general principles were given and not like a very specific prescription. You should do this at this particular time on this particular day. And if you miss this, then there'll be this punishment. The Gita is not really into that sort of stuff, like most of the Upanishadic literatures. There's another literature. The Hindu scriptures are like vast. And in short, they're called the Vedas. And the Vedas, there are 4 Vedas, and each Veda has 4 parts to them. And 3 of 4 parts of all the Vedas deals with like material things. They're called the Karma Kanda section of the Vedas. So that section of the Vedas is what you will kind of find in other religions today also, like extremely prescriptive. You must do this on this particular day at that particular time. Otherwise, there will be this particular consequence. It's kind of, there's a sense of it being a little bit oppressive, a little bit, uninspiring, basically. And the 3/4 portion of the Vedas that deal with this material thing is exactly like what you would probably find in other, the popular traditions of today. The 4th part of the Vedic literatures are called the Upanishads, which is, famous for dealing with the spiritual subject matter. And the Gita itself is also called the Gita-Upanishad, which means its interest is precisely the world beyond matter. So in that, you don't find the sort of oppressive sense of it, the oppressive prescriptive sense that you kind of get in religion. You kind of get a worldview that tries to identify the soul as different from matter and tries to help the soul navigate that world to the point of self-discovery and perhaps a world beyond this world. And so I like the Gita for that reason. That was one of my, when I first read the Gita when I was 18, that was my particular appreciation of it. It was just like very principle based. I even remember right when I became a Krishna Bhakta, I was getting into Gita. I had a friend who was getting into, the born again Christian group. And they kind of mean, I ain't gonna lie, like they don't really like people that, that don't do Christian stuff, Jesus. Yeah. And I didn't know that. I will come to discover that because my friend dropped me like a bad habit once she realized I wasn't going to become a born again Christian. But she was becoming a born again Christian at the same time I was getting into like Krishna Bhakti. And I was going to all of her events for like many, many months just to encourage her in her own spiritual journey. And also because I was just like getting into spirituality and I just thought it was kind of cool to, be around other spiritual groups. And I remember when I would go to a lot of these programs, I would be sharing principles from the Bhagavad Gita without telling where I got it from because I knew that would be frowned upon. And I remember specifically having the experience of people like, wow, this is so amazing. This is so deep. What amazing principles. And it kind of spoke to them as long as they didn't know it was from Bhagavad Gita. Of course, later on, they found out I was into Krishna Bhakti and they dropped me like a bad habit. But that was the reason why I appreciated the Gita, because it's not extremely prescriptive in the way that you would encounter in a lot of the Vedic literatures or in other religions. It's trying to tell you about the soul and the kind of the journey the soul needs to take out of the world of preoccupation with the world of matter, that is.
But what about the 3rd part of the Vedas that you spoke about? Because I've been around, let's say, I'm not sure if I can call it Hindu culture because it's in Colombia. So I don't know how much translates from India over to Colombia, and I've never been to India.
Yes.
But I see that there are tons of like regulations that you are supposed to follow. Yes. And I'd say most of what I've seen is if it has a purpose, and if in my view it doesn't, it's at least benign. Like it's not um, infringing upon people's liberties.
Yes,
But I can see that there are also some practices
of course.
and some views that do not match with whatever um,
Yeah, like other
like what we
traditions.
see as good and bad right now in the world. Not that that's perfect, but there are some things that we have come to um, regarding respect for people's differences, let's say sexually,
Yeah,
that I don't know how that plays out in Indian culture and in Hindu religious groups, and
yes,
like, I'm not sure how to parse those and how to make them work.
yes. Again, coming back to this modes of nature topic, these you can basically understand all principles in terms of these modes of nature. And there'll be a lot of principles that, because the idea is to help people get into the mode of goodness, because that's the sustaining force of nature. And you want things to be sustained and from there to grow and prosper. That is also part of the mode of goodness. And so there are a lot of rules that are given by which it is understood that this force of nature can be dominant, and from that it can things can grow nicely. So you have to be able to, I don't recommend anyone follow anything that they don't understand. So if you have to like study why a prescription is given, I often like to suggest that one looks at it in terms of these forces of nature. Certain things are, we're told not to do certain things because it increases the mode of ignorance or increases the mode of passion, which may deviate us from a more sustainable, flourishing situation. For example, there will be a prescription: get up early, get up 45 minutes before the sun rises and perform, your religious duty or your spiritual duty, whatever it is. Don't sleep until, noon, because if you do that, that increases the ignorant force in your psychology, which makes it more difficult for you to understand things. It makes it more difficult to be productive, and so on. So when you look at all the principles in the Vedas or in any tradition, if you look at them in terms of these forces and you can test them out, what happens to my psychology when I practice a certain thing, or when I don't practice a certain thing, what happens to my psychology? And that way you can understand why a certain rule is given and why a certain, how you say, regulation is given. So I would just recommend looking at that. When you think of things like sexuality, for example, the sex is related to the creative force of nature, the mode of passion, and creativity. The ultimate sort of expression of the creative force of sex on a gross physical level is the production of children. That's how the old world understood it. And that sexual energy, if not used to produce children, should be sublimated to sort of give life to the world in the form of art, music, because all of these things take the creative force of nature to produce art, to produce music, to produce even homes and houses and so on. If you're not going to use that creative force, well, not that you're not going to, when the creative force is not being squarely used for giving life in the form of a child, for example, then it can be used for giving life to the world in the form of your art and et cetera. And there's an understanding that that creative force, it has a tendency to become very destructive very fast, which means it glides down to ignorance very quickly if one does not use it carefully. And I think when you look at like the pornography world, for example, it proves how destructive that force can be when it's not informed by a higher force of nature. And so therefore there will be all these other rules that, governing even sex and sexuality, with the intuition that if it's not placed under some control, then it can get really wild and it can get really dangerous. And I think our world is actually really proven that in terrible, terrible ways.
Here's my take on that. I can see how total disregard for the meaningfulness and care that we have to give our sexual relations like can easily lead to personal and social detriment
Yes.
on average.
Yes.
But I also see another side of the spectrum where the only motive to engage in sexual activity is to procreate. Uh, I don't see it as equally detrimental. It depends on how you're enforcing that.
Yeah.
But I at least see it as depriving of a range of experiences that can induce well-being and connection. Like and you can tell by whatever I say that well-being is like something that is like it's one of my leading motives in life. Um,
Yes.
and I know people can not understand because I usually define well-being really broadly, and people conflate it with instant pleasure. I think
Yeah.
um, hurt and suffering, temporary suffering, can lead to higher states of well-being as
Yes.
well.
Yes. So it's hard to understand why all principles are at play. Sometimes you have to have your own personal experience or investigation, take data. But again, just using the sexual thing as an example, sex can be connected to well-being, and I'm saying that largely for the old world, it was for having children because that brings well-being not only to yourself but to a whole society. After all, if you want a society to continue, you need to have children in order to continue it. So it brings well-being to others as well. But there's a sense that if people, there's again using just your example of that um, short-term suffering for long-term happiness, and I think that's a principle that people don't understand as clearly in the modern world, especially in a
Mhm.
world where all of our pleasure is so quickly available to us through a phone, through a click of a button. We don't, we don't, we don't always clearly understand that principle that sometimes immediate pleasure can lead to suffering in the long run, or immediate suffering can lead to long-term happiness in the long run. So not understanding that, it makes it also hard to understand certain principles because certain principles are connected to long-term well-being, but requires immediate sort of tension in the heart because you have to restrain yourself from something. You should not do something that's giving some sort of mental pain. So when it comes, and sometimes the long-term benefit is like really long-term, like for a whole life and you can't always appreciate that long-term effect of a particular principle. And so it becomes outdated or jaded. People become jaded with it and they kind of just give it up. So that's the part and I think this is the part that humanity has a hard time with. When you have to like figure out everything for yourself, then it's quite easy to choose a principle that may hurt you in the long run and reject a principle that may actually be good for you in the long run. When you're forced to figure out what's going to bring long-term well-being and reduce suffering for yourself. So
It is really hard to do that from our current state of ignorance.
yes, exactly. So at least even taking the religious, spiritual part out of it, at least the way it used to work in the older world is that you inherited your morals, right?
Hmm.
You have persons who have gone through the experience directly. Yeah, I did this shit when I was young and now I'm suffering. Sort of thing. And you kind of inherited that. They gave that sort of knowledge to the next generation. And then the next generation, they had their own experience and so on. They kind of gave it to them. What you find in the modern world is this like sort of wholesale rejection of the old world or of the previous generation. And therefore the necessity to constantly rebuild yourself anew. And because your starting point is ignorance, when you have to constantly rebuild yourself anew, you're making profound mistakes that have already been made and that could have been avoided if you were only able to appreciate the sort of wisdom that was given from the generation of old. So in the Eastern spirituality, this used to be like a big principle, like honor your forefathers minimally. If you're not going to be into God and all that, you got to minimally honor your forefathers. There's still a sense of that culture in India today, but it's going down. They have given the principles by which you can prosper in ways that they may not have been able to prosper because they had to figure out things for themselves. But as soon as you reject that and you try to just reinvent yourself, well, good luck. And then, of course, people are going to say, well, I'm suffering. That's the spice of life. I'm like, well, that must be one spicy life then, because you are not ignorant. All of our starting point is ignorance. So, the
there's something. There's a something a guy I follow on Twitter said the other day that is really relevant to not being able to take in suffering for some time, foreseeing reward later, and he said something like cheap dopamine is the modern devil. I think he was talking about Instagram and Twitter and Netflix.
Yes, and we could call the phone as like a dopamine dispenser. It's like the enemy of the soul, frankly speaking.
Yeah.
And and now we are forced to live on our phones and computers because of the modern quarantine situation. So yeah.
I think we've covered almost everything I wanted to talk about. It took us a little longer, but I thought we would. I wanted to mention to whomever is listening to us in the States or in Colombia that regarding the topic of Black Lives Matter that we spoke of at the beginning, and I also mentioned this to you, there are African American people that share Jay's point of view. They come from different backgrounds. Some of them liberals, some of them are conservatives, and I would like to suggest for those interested to read on their points, because they are making the same points you are making, and for people to know that you are not the only one raising this question.
Yeah.
And they are Coleman Hughes, he's a philosopher from Columbia University. John McWhorter, he's a linguist. Glenn Lowry is an economist. Chloe S. Valdery, she has a really cool thing that's called Theory of Enchantment. And Thomas Chatterton Williams, he's a novelist, and he wrote an incredibly insightful novel called Unlearning Race, and just to make you feel not that alone, and so people know that there are other voices with different perspectives out there that are coming to the same conclusions that you are. So
nice. So we're not racist.
I hope we're not.
I'm black, by the way. Everyone listening, if you don't know, I have a black body.
Yeah. I think you mentioned it.
Yeah.
No, I'm really, really, really. That's three reallys. Thankful to you and to your time, and that you sat down to have this conversation with me, Jay.
I'm also thankful. I'm flattered and a little bit embarrassed and appreciative of your kindness toward me. May I have more whenever I get a chance to come to Colombia? I was supposed to be there in August, but now due to quarantine, I won't be able to come until later.
Okay, but when you're here, I'd really like us to sit down and talk in person.
That would be great.
Maybe let people know where they can find you so they follow you on Instagram. I really like your chit chats, and I really like the quotes you put up, and it's a really cool account to follow. So let people know where they.
Yeah, my Instagram account is Urban Sage Deliberates. Urban Sage Deliberates is my Instagram account. And yeah, I think that's the place I'm most active on social media. I do have a Twitter account, but I don't really use it. I haven't really gotten into Twitter yet. I feel like Twitter is just a place for starting some shit. And I also have a little bit of spirit like that, but I usually like to just share ideas sort of dispassionately. And so I kind of just use my Instagram for that, so they can check me out there if they like.
Okay. Really cool. Okay, so thanks, Jay.
All right. Thank you very much, Martin.